All right, so today we are diving deep into a moment in history that I think really sends chills down your spine, the Battle of Fort Sumter.
Absolutely.
And I know you listening at home want to know how this seemingly isolated event, I mean, how could this spark a whole civil war?
Right.
But luckily you came prepared. You brought an amazing resource with you.
I did.
An episode of the American History Hit podcast featuring historian Alan Goloso.
Yeah, one of the greats.
So let's unpack this powder keg, shall we?
Let's do it. So,
Well,
yeah.
what gets me is that Fort Sumter wasn't just some strategic military target.
Right.
It was practically a powder keg of symbolism just on its own.
Yeah.
So picture this, okay?
Okay.
Charleston Harbor,
Mm-hmm.
South Carolina, and right smack in the middle is this imposing brick and mortar pentagon, as they describe it.
Huh.
It's 1861. The newly formed Confederate States of America are staring right at it.
It's wild to think about.
Isn't it?
Our source material describes Fort Sumter as part of this network of coastal defenses.
Built in the early 1800s.
Yeah.
But why this fort?
Yeah.
Of all the forts, why did this one become the flashpoint?
Because it was a huge poke in the eye to the Confederates,
Really?
especially to South Carolina. Charleston was their pride and joy.
Oh, yeah.
Bustling port city, the heart of their economy.
Of course.
To have this federal fort representing a government they just rejected planted right there.
Yeah.
Unacceptable.
It was less about military strategy then and more about just...
A battle of wills.
Yeah.
A clash of ideologies.
Your clash of ideologies, that's a great way to put it.
It really was.
It was a power struggle playing out in brick and mortar.
Literally.
And you know what I find interesting, too, is that this wasn't some sudden explosion of violence.
No.
This tension had been simmering for months.
Think for sure.
Negotiations going back and forth.
Absolutely.
Initially, South Carolina figured they'd just get the fort handed over peacefully.
Yeah, makes sense, right?
Yeah, I mean, why not?
They were in control of the state.
Right, exactly. But the U.S. government under President Buchanan wasn't about to just give up federal property.
Right. They saw it as rightfully theirs.
Of course.
So you can imagine the frustration on both sides.
Yeah, I can only imagine. Did anyone think it would actually lead to war?
It's hard to say for sure,
Mm-hmm.
but the sources definitely paint this picture of escalating tensions.
Oh, for sure.
And what's interesting is that you have this seemingly straightforward question
Mm-hmm.
of ownership, like who legally controlled the fort.
Yeah.
But it gets tangled up with these deeply rooted beliefs about states' rights and the very nature of the Union.
Right, and we talked about that in our previous episodes about all the tension around these issues.
Right, exactly.
So it really was a powder keg waiting for a spark.
It was just waiting for the right moment.
And that spark came in the form of Major Robert Anderson, the Union commander at Fort Sumter.
Oh, yeah, he's a fascinating figure.
He's described in the podcast as a man of honor, bound by duty, but also incredibly strategic. And he knew his original position at nearby Fort Moultrie was vulnerable.
Right, much more vulnerable than Fort Sumter.
And he decided to make a pretty daring move,
He did.
moving all his troops under the cover of darkness to Fort Sumter.
Yeah, that was a stroke of genius.
It was.
Not only did it give the Union a stronger defensive position,
Right.
but it dramatically raised the stakes.
Yeah.
Suddenly, the Confederates are in a bind,
Right.
attack, and risk starting a full-blown war or back down and appear weak.
Wow. What would you have done?
I don't know.
Knowing the weight of history rested on your shoulders?
You've got the fate of the nation in your hands, basically.
Yeah, talk about pressure.
Yeah.
And right in the middle of this standoff walks in Abraham Lincoln,
Oh, boy.
the newly elected president.
Talk about bad timing.
I know, facing a crisis he never wanted.
You can't imagine inheriting a bigger mess.
Lincoln genuinely believed, at least initially, that he could find a peaceful solution.
He really did. He was an optimist at heart.
But then Major Anderson reports dwindling supplies at Fort Sumter.
Oh.
And Lincoln realizes he can't just stand by and watch.
Yeah, he's forced to make a decision.
He's trapped between a rock and a hard place.
Totally.
Surrender the fort and his presidency is undermined before it even begins.
Right.
Take military action and risk all-out war.
It was a nightmare scenario for a new president.
What a way to start your presidency.
Yeah, talk about trial by fire.
Our source really emphasizes Lincoln's internal struggle.
Oh, absolutely. He understood the gravity of the situation.
Yeah.
And his decision to resupply Fort Sumter, while seemingly peaceful, was a calculated gamble.
It was a power move disguised as a humanitarian mission.
Right.
Sending only provisions, not reinforcements.
Interesting tactic.
It forced the Confederates' hand.
It really did.
It basically said, I'm holding my ground, but I'm not escalating. Your move.
So did that make war inevitable at that point?
I mean, it certainly added fuel to the fire.
Oh, yeah, no question.
Confederate President Jefferson Davis saw Lincoln's resupply mission as a direct challenge.
As he would.
He ordered General P.G.T. Beauregard, the Confederate commander in Charleston, to demand Fort Sumter's surrender.
Right.
And if they refused, well, let's just say he wasn't planning on sending them a fruit basket.
No, he had other plans.
So the fuse was lit.
Oh, yeah.
And all it took was a spark to ignite the whole powder keg.
And that spark came at 4:30 a.m. on April 12th, 1861,
Oh, boy.
when Confederate guns roared to life.
Whoa.
The bombardment of Fort Sumter had begun.
And with it, the American Civil War.
The nation was now at war.
I mean, 34 hours?
I know, it's hard to even imagine.
Of just relentless shelling. I mean, did those soldiers inside have any idea what they were in for?
I mean, it's hard to fathom, isn't it?
Yeah.
You're huddled inside this fort, the walls are shaking,
Right.
explosions all around you.
Yeah.
But interestingly, though, the podcast points out that the actual damage to the fort was mostly superficial.
Wait, really?
Yeah.
I always pictured Fort Sumter being just reduced to rubble.
That actually came later. During the bombardment, most of the Confederate shells just missed their mark.
Wow.
In fact, the podcast mentions that there were no casualties during the shelling itself.
No casualties?
And you believe that?
It's almost more terrifying in a way.
Right.
Knowing you're a sitting duck, but somehow surviving this
It
onslaught.
must have been just a psychological battle.
Oh, yeah.
As much as a physical one.
For sure. And eventually the inevitable happened.
Yeah.
The Union garrison, low on supplies, facing this relentless barrage, was forced to surrender on April 14th.
And that was it.
That moment, the fall of Fort Sumter, marked the official start of the American Civil War.
It did.
It's hard to wrap your head around how a single event centered around what seems like a relatively small fort could plunge an entire nation into such a devastating conflict.
It speaks to the power of symbolism, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Fort Sumter became this focal point for all the tensions that have been building for years.
Right.
It's like the podcast says, Fort Sumter, built by the feds, was seized by the state, and the Civil War began.
Wow. Such a simple statement, but it really captures that seismic shift in power.
It does.
And what's even more fascinating is how this relatively bloodless battle, at least initially, may have actually contributed to the war's escalation.
Yeah, that's a really insightful point the podcast makes.
Okay.
The episode describes these celebrations in the North after the fall of Fort Sumter.
Oh, wow.
Parades for Major Anderson in New York City.
Really?
It seems there was this initial optimism, this belief that the conflict could be quickly resolved.
It's like they thought, okay, we made our point.
Right.
They made theirs.
Right.
Now let's all just shake hands and go home.
Exactly.
But we know that's not how it played out.
Not even close.
That early optimism may have actually fueled a sense of overconfidence,
Right.
a belief that the war would be a walk in the park.
Yeah, that this would be over in a matter of weeks.
But as we know, the reality was far more brutal.
Far more.
It's a reminder that even the most dramatic events can be deceptive. The true cost, the long-term consequences, often unfold in ways we can't initially grasp.
You just never know how things are going to play out.
And in the case of Fort Sumter, despite the lack of bloodshed at the time, it unleashed a torrent of violence that would scar the nation for generations.
A scar that we still feel today.
So the fall of Fort Sumter was just the opening act in this much larger tragedy.
The first chapter in a very long and bloody story.
Exactly. And you know, it's interesting.
What's that?
The podcast highlights how Fort Sumter, despite being reduced to rubble, continued to be a point of contention throughout the war.
Oh, yeah. It became this symbol.
It's almost as if it became a symbol of defiance,
Right.
a constant reminder of the unfinished business between the North and the South.
Exactly. The fact that it remained under Confederate control for most of the war,
Wow.
despite repeated attempts by the Union to recapture it, just added to its symbolic weight.
Wow. And get this. The podcast even points out that the fort, even in its ruined state, was actually harder to capture than when it was intact.
Isn't that interesting? Those piles of rubble provided surprisingly effective cover.
Wow. So even in its destruction, Fort Sumter continued to play a role in the conflict.
It's like a ghost that just wouldn't go away.
It wasn't until General Sherman's march through South Carolina in 1865 that Fort Sumter finally returned to Union control.
Right towards the very end of the war.
And even then, it wasn't through a bloody battle, but rather through Confederate abandonment.
They just slipped away in the night.
It's almost poetic, isn't it?
It is.
This symbol of the war's beginning finally reclaimed in the war's final days.
A full circle moment.
And there's an even more poignant detail in the podcast.
Oh, yeah.
They describe this grand ceremony held at Fort Sumter on April 14th, 1865, exactly 4 years to the day after its surrender.
I get chills just thinking about it.
And guess who was there to raise the flag in victory?
Woo!
Major Anderson.
The one and only.
The same man who had lowered the flag in defeat was back to raise it in triumph.
What a powerful moment of closure.
It is, but knowing history, I can't help but wonder if there's a twist coming.
Oh, you know there is.
Okay, what is it?
That very night,
Oh no.
as the nation celebrated the end of the war and the symbolic rebirth of Fort Sumter,
Yeah.
President Lincoln was assassinated at Ford's Theater.
Oh my gosh, it's like something out of a Shakespearean tragedy.
I know.
A moment of triumph, a glimmer of hope for the future, instantly extinguished by an act of violence.
It's a stark reminder of how fragile peace can be,
Yeah,
especially in the wake of such a divisive conflict.
absolutely. And it also highlights another fascinating aspect of this story that the podcast delves into,
What's that?
the early use of the term Reconstruction.
Oh, yeah, that's interesting.
You mean the period after the Civil War when the South was rebuilt and reintegrated into the Union?
Right.
But you're saying this term was being used even before the war had fully ended.
That's right.
Wow.
The podcast describes this idea even as the nation was mobilizing for war,
Okay.
that perhaps a peaceful resolution could still be found.
Wow.
They talk about this proposed national convention, a grand coming together to reconstruct the Union and the Constitution.
That's incredible. Imagine that.
I know.
Even in the midst of such division, there were still those who believed reconciliation was possible.
It speaks to the complexity of the human spirit, doesn't it?
It does.
Even in the face of unimaginable hardship, there's this innate desire for unity, for healing.
But as the podcast points out, those hopes for a quick and painless reconstruction faded fast.
Yeah, reality set in pretty quickly.
Yeah, within weeks of Fort Sumter.
Exactly.
The reality set in.
This wasn't going to be a war settled over a negotiating table.
Right.
It was going to be a brutal, bloody conflict,
Yeah.
one that would test the very fabric of the nation.
And just a few months later, at the First Battle of Bull Run, the nation got a taste of just how brutal this conflict would become.
Bull Run was a wake-up call, wasn't it?
Oh, yeah.
The naive enthusiasm and romanticism that had surrounded the early days of the war evaporated
Yeah.
in the face of the carnage and chaos of that first major battle.
You know, it's interesting. The podcast doesn't delve into Bull Run specifically, but it does draw this insightful connection between Fort Sumter and the broader trajectory of the war.
Oh, yeah.
It argues that even though Fort Sumter itself was a relatively small-scale engagement,
Right.
it set in motion a chain of events that ultimately led to the much larger and more devastating conflicts to come.
And that's the power of a symbolic act.
Mm-hmm.
Fort Sumter wasn't just about bricks and mortar.
Right.
It was about principles,
Mm-hmm.
ideologies, and a clash of wills.
Wow.
And that clash, once ignited, couldn't be easily contained.
Yeah, it's mind-blowing to think that something like the firing on Fort Sumter,
Right.
which feels almost symbolic in its way, could have such a ripple effect. It's
Mhm.
like the butterfly effect, but on a historical scale.
Exactly. And you know what's fascinating to me is that the legacy of Fort Sumter goes way beyond the Civil War itself.
Okay.
It still stands today
Oh, yeah.
as a powerful symbol of the constant struggle for unity
Yeah.
and just how fragile democracy really is.
Yeah, thinking about it now,
Yeah.
it makes you wonder how we can learn from these historical echoes
Right.
to navigate the divisions and uncertainties of our own time.
You're hitting on something really important.
Yeah.
The Battle of Fort Sumter reminds us that even seemingly small events
Right.
can snowball into something with huge and lasting consequences.
Absolutely.
It underscores the importance of understanding history,
Mm-hmm.
not just as a list of names and dates,
Right.
but as a web of choices and actions that continue to shape our world today.
It really drives home the point that the past isn't just something we read about in textbooks. It's alive.
It is.
It's influencing us and it's shaping the future.
Absolutely.
Right.
And perhaps most importantly, it challenges us to think about how we can handle our own moments of division and uncertainty.
Yeah.
How can we have those tough conversations?
Right.
How can we bridge the gaps between different viewpoints?
Yeah.
How can we stop those sparks of conflict from turning into an inferno?
Right. Those are heavy but essential questions to ponder.
They are.
Well, this has been an incredible deep dive into the Battle of Fort Sumter,
It really has.
exploring all the complexities and contradictions of this pivotal event has been a real eye-opener.
It's been a pleasure unpacking this moment in history with you.
And as always, we encourage you to keep digging, keep exploring, and keep those critical thinking gears turning.
Right?
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, and until next time, stay curious.